I'll be talking to Tom-Pierre Frappé-Sénéclauze, who is the program director for buildings at the Pembina Institute, about the British Columbia's new greenhouse gas emission numbers. So welcome to the interview, Tom-Pierre.
Good to be with you.
Now, this is really interesting because BC is seen as one of the leading provinces in terms of climate ambitions. It has the Clean BC policy, which is supposed to take the province from 64 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year down to 16 million tons by I think it's 2050. It's got 2030 targets, but the numbers that came out the other day have not a lot of progress so far.
Yeah, and I can't say that we're thoroughly surprised by this. There's a lot of delay. Like, our economy is a complex machine, and it takes, like a big ship, it takes a while to turn it, change direction. And so these are 2020 numbers, which, really reflect policies that were in place before that. And we know we had a brief history of success on our climate policy around like 2007, 2008, 2009, when the kind of previous government had this epiphany where like climate mattered, and a lot of good policies were brought on board, like the carbon tax. And for a little while, we had a decoupling of economic growth and emissions. Like, emissions went down and economy went up, and it was a success story. But, followed after that about 10 years of climate policy inaction. And that's, I think, what we're seeing, those 2020 numbers, is those 10 years of not continuing to push forward more climate policies.
Right. I think it's fair to say that as the economy expands, but more importantly, as the population grows, as BC's has, then whatever gains you get from, a $20 or $30 a ton carbon tax, but not much else, not much other policy, is pretty soon erased because the price per ton doesn't go up, or doesn't go up very much.
Yeah, that's good. And there are other policies, like there's, the building codes have evolved quite quickly so that we build more energy efficient buildings. There is some gentle mode shift. There is, uptake, like the EV rebates have led to significant uptake of EV in BC. So but you're right, like these are, gains in efficiency and slight gains in carbon intensity of the energy that's being used, like decrease in carbon intensity. But overall, as we see, not quite at the scale we need to decouple with economic growth and population growth. Yes.
Now, I went over the data that was provided by the government, and one of the things that stuck out to me is the fact that the government gives the inventory a credit, actually about 48 million tons, if I remember correctly, for forest management, basically arguing that the forest traps, I guess, or sequesters that much CO2. And I have to tell you, I'm always a little suspicious of those, that maybe they're being overstated. I know some critics have argued that. What's your take on it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this is not my field of expertise, and I haven't looked at those numbers in particular. We can't neglect land-based carbon, both in terms of emissions and sinks, right? Like, it is a huge part of the carbon cycle on the planet, is what our oceans and what our land masses, including our forests for Canada, are doing. So it is good and wise to track it, to look into it, and to act on it. Nobody can argue that we want worse forest management, especially with all the fires that we've seen. Whether those credits are warranted, like that, unfortunately, requires the opinion of foresters that can look at how we're managing our forests. I'm not a forester, but also, of course, is a complex question, right? Like, it's a additionality question. Like, is what we're doing needing to net new increase in carbon? Are we talking about literally the forest capturing more carbon, or is it a credit game where had we not done this, we would have led to even more deforestation, and therefore, compared to a business as usual, we're not as bad off. So I think that's a big distinction that we need to make, whether these are kind of credits or whether these are estimates of actually the forest in BC becoming a greater sink of carbon.
Now, what is it in Pembina's opinion that the BC government needs to do more of, or it's doing something that it shouldn't be doing?
Well, we've been quite pleased with the last two rounds of climate plans from BC. Like, there's always things that we could tweak and want differently, but the big policies that have been announced, partially in the last like roadmap to 2030, are very meaningful, and I would say, politically courageous. We look at climate policy from several angles, like whether they're effective, whether they will lead to carbon decarbonization at the pace that we need. And here, of course, we're always a little bit disappointed. Like, no government is acting with the emergency that is required of this moment. But
Right.
within the spectrum of political action, what policy is doing is a piece of leadership. They've taken political steps that are courageous and that will have real tangible effect on the emissions. And I think we'll see those. And there's like three main big policies that are currently being drafted, in Victoria by where the political mandate has been given, and now we're in the work of the bureaucrats actually writing the regulations. There's, how we're going to curb down the emissions from the oil and gas sector, how we're going to implement an emission cap on all the gas utilities, so mostly providing gas to residential and commercial buildings and a bit of transportation and industry as well. And excuse me, and how we're going to reduce methane leaks in BC. Like, we have a target of 75% reduction by 2030, which is in line with the federal target. There's a target to go to near total elimination by 2035. But we haven't seen yet the regulations that want to drive these. So all these three, these are big policies that will drive carbon down, that are right now being regulated. So what we need to do is, keep the pressure on, make sure these policies come out in time, and then look at the fine print, make sure they are designed to be effective.
I think we can all say that this is maybe an example of the challenges that policymakers face. I mean, BC stands in good stead, right? Its emissions aren't as high as, say, its neighbor in Alberta, which is, I think, if I remember correctly, 263 million tons a year or something like that. It's very high. And it has 97, 98% emissions-free electricity because of hydro. I mean, it starts from a good place, but even when you start in a good place, the challenge of making policy, doing it in a timely fashion, as that matches the urgency of the climate crisis. Even in BC, it's very difficult.
Yeah, and there's two reasons for that. One is that it requires kind of a shift. We talk about like a new industrial era, right? Like, there's a shift from a lot more electrification, for example, and of course renewable, instead of our dependence on oil and gas, which are still a huge source of our energy pie, right? And are incredibly convenient. Like, we've been able to achieve huge amount of societal and technological progress because of fossil fuels. Now we need to transfer to a different source of energy, and that's a fundamental kind of shift in our energy system. So that's a real challenge, even for BC, which, as you said, has some of the best cards to do this. And really, we should hold BC to account to make that transition within its own resources as well. Because if BC can't do it, then we can't really expect the rest of the world to do it. So BC needs to be consequent with its potential and with its political volition. That's one reason. The other reason is, of course, that our consumption habits are not quite in line with the reality of living on a finite planet, and that's a harder societal conversation that is challenging for politicians to, the language of sacrifice does not help anybody, but yet we need very different lifestyle, which can be, much happier lifestyles. And there's a lot of conversation around this, around land use, for example, shifting from kind of the living, in the suburbs with, yes, everybody their little land and their little house, but then you're so isolated that you need your car each time to do anything, and you never walk to get your groceries, and therefore you don't eat your neighbors, So there's some shift in terms of generational shift in terms of where people want to live, what they value, privacy and space versus kind of convenience and the porosity, if you want, of more dense living arrangement. So there's some useful shift in land use in the way we design our communities, but there's still like profound shifts in our consumption patterns that we've not really addressed. And it's going to be difficult to fully do this transition while maintaining this idea that we can, keep exactly the same lifestyle in the same ways. Like the 1-for-1 swap, and we're just going to change your gasoline car for an electric car is easy politically on some levels, but we all know that less dependency on individual vehicles is really what we want, and more public transportation and more walking to where you need to go.
Well, that's okay. Let's wrap up our this interview, Tom-Pierre, with further that discussion a little bit, because I live in British Columbia and I don't see that discussion taking place except maybe on the fringes of the environmental group. But it's not a mainstream discussion right now, though I have to say, actually, the conversation around active transportation, maybe I should have included that, because there are, there's a large community of cyclists and natural. So maybe it's more advanced here than it is in other provinces. Be that as it may, where is the political leadership going to emerge so that conversation becomes more robust? And then I would just add to this, it seems there's a lot of technology coming down the pipe that will have an effect on that conversation. And I think of, you don't want everybody to have an electric car, then we need things like robo-taxis, automated shuttles, to get people back and forth to public transportation. And those are only a few years out, and they could profoundly affect the nature of those conversations.
Yeah, and including, the change in our work habits, right? Like the pandemic has shifted a lot of culture from working from home, including here, and that will also change our driving pattern and our cultural expectations. I do think there is a fair amount of leadership in BC, particularly at the local government level. So the Climate Action Charter, which, in 2007 or 10, like one of the brilliant moments of that moment of creativity around climate policy was the Climate Action Charter. It's saying like, hey, local governments, we will rebate you your carbon tax, and you'll be able to use that fund to do like climate policy and climate projects in your community if you sign this Climate Action Charter and do a community energy plan. And that led to a whole bunch of creativity around like, how do we reduce emissions from our transportation and our buildings, which are kind of the two main sources of emission within communities that don't necessarily have a huge industrial land base. And that also had a whole kind of an agreement to aim for dense, compact, livable communities. I'd say like that aspect of tying the land use conversation with the Climate Action Charter is still a work in progress. Like some communities have really embraced it. Others, I would say, like it's still in discussion. And so I think that's where we'll see the next generation of that, partially when it comes to land use and the way we build our communities. And the municipal election this fall, hopefully we'll have a lot of conversation around this. Like, what do we want our town to look like? How do we want it to feel like, and who do we want to feel comfortable here, so much so forth. And so local governments in BC have politically a lot of power, and they have a fair amount of tools on the climate side, from kind of their capacity to regulate buildings, to adopt step code and other things. But the most important one is, how they envision their community and what does that mean in terms of zoning and land use. And that conversation, and including provincially, like there is this desire to revamp a little bit that aspect of Climate Action Charter. And because there's an admission that like we didn't exactly nail that part, and we need to rekindle this conversation locally to say like, what does that look like to have a livable, dense, compact community?
Well, Tom-Pierre, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much, Markham.